Who were the women warriors? Hidden in ancient armies, and why were they erased from history? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back, far back, to a world of bronze and smoke, of cracked shields and soft fading campfires. So if you're lying in bed, maybe with the light turned low, just breathe out, let the day slip away, and prepare to wander through one of history's quieter mysteries. The forgotten women of ancient warfare, because as it turns out, the past wasn't quite as male-dominated as the textbooks liked to pretend. There were women who fought, who led, who bled, who died in battle, but over the centuries they were steadily erased. Sometimes politely, sometimes deliberately, and sometimes just because the chronicler couldn't quite believe what he'd seen. Let's drift there now to the edges of recorded history, where myth archaeology and dusty footnotes overlap. The convenient forgetting. You've probably noticed that when ancient texts mention women in combat, it's usually with a faint air of disbelief. Herodotus, that old gossip columnist of the ancient world, loved to tell strange tales. He described the Scythians, nomadic horse, archers who roamed the steppes north of the Black Sea, as having women who could ride, shoot, and kill just as well as men. Naturally, Greek men found this both fascinating and horrifying, so they invented a label, Amazons, half myth, half ethnography, and entirely filtered through male anxiety. To them, the idea of a woman who didn't stay home, weaving but instead showed up to stab someone in the ribs, was just too much. And yet archaeologists have found graves, hundreds of them belonging to real Scythian women buried with bows, arrows, and scars from battle. So the evidence was there all along. The problem was that later historians preferred a neat story over a messy truth. They preferred their women mythological, easier to control that way. Let's linger on one of those graves for a moment. The girl with the iron arrowheads. Somewhere in what's now Kazakhstan, there lies a burial mound dating back to around the 5th century BCE. Inside it, archaeologists found the remains of a young woman, no older than 20. Her bones showed signs of riding from a young age, and her pelvis had healed from a sword wound. She'd been buried with a quiver of iron-tipped arrows, a dagger, and curiously a mirror. The mirror, of course, confused early researchers, because when you find weapons and armor with a male skeleton, it's a warrior's grave. But when you find them with a female skeleton, it's suddenly symbolic. Eventually, DNA testing caught up with the 19th century disbelief. It turns out many supposed male warriors found on the steppe were women all along. The bones didn't lie, but the assumptions did. And so, bit by bit, the story had to be rewritten. It seems the Amazons weren't so mythical after all, just inconvenient. The irony of the unwomanly warrior. It's funny in a quietly depressing way how ancient writers went to such lengths to both admire and condemn these women. The Greeks, ever conflicted about power, portrayed Amazons as both noble and unnatural. They were fierce, loyal, brave, and therefore had to die at the hands of men in every story. Because otherwise, how could the world make sense? So the Greeks built statues of them, carved their battles into temple friezes, and then solemnly declared them imaginary. It's a little like writing fan fiction about someone you insist doesn't exist, when reality looked like legend. Meanwhile, outside of Greek imagination, entire tribes and kingdoms had women who fought openly. Let's drift westward now, toward Anatolia and the Near East, where records whisper of women who led armies long before the word Amazon even existed. One of them was Artemisia Fern of Caria, a Greek queen who commanded ships during the Persian Wars, around 480 BCE. She was a naval commander under Xerxes, the same Xerxes who thought invading Greece would be a great idea, and then found out otherwise. Artemisia warned him not to attack Salamis. Naturally, he ignored her. Naturally, she was right. When the Persian fleet began to crumble, she turned her ship and rammed another Persian vessel, convincing everyone nearby she was fighting for the Greeks. It worked. She escaped. Xerxes, watching from the shore, is said to have muttered, "My men have become women and my women men." He meant it as an insult, but in hindsight, it feels more like a prophecy. The ones who led. Hey again. If you're still awake, though, I won't hold it against you if you aren't. Let's pick up where we left off. We've drifted through the world of ancient warriors and forgotten tombs, where women once rode beside men into battle, only to vanish later into legend. Now, as the centuries turn and the swords get a little heavier, the armor a bit shinier, we find ourselves in the world of castles and crusades. A world that officially was not supposed to include women on the battlefield. But of course, reality never got the memo. When religion met iron, the Middle Ages were, among other things, a time when faith and steel often traveled together. Pilgrimages turned into wars. Wars turned into pilgrimages. And people managed to convince themselves that marching thousands of miles to stab strangers was a holy act. The Crusades were, shall we say, morally complicated. And yet, in that swirl of zeal, greed, and dust, there were women who decided, quite literally, to armor up. Chroniclers mention them only briefly, usually with a tone of polite alarm. One account of the First Crusade mentions women riding and fighting like men, which sounds like admiration. But the writer quickly adds that they were an embarrassment to their sex. So that's nice. Still, they were there. Some fought in disguise, others openly, and a few were noble women who refused to sit home waiting for letters that might never arrive. The Lady of Antioch. Let's drift for a moment to the Eastern Mediterranean, where the sun is heavy and the Crusader states are barely holding themselves together. Here we find Sibylla of Jerusalem, a queen who ruled, however briefly, one of the most unstable kingdoms in medieval history. Now, being Queen of Jerusalem in the 12th century was a bit like being handed a leaking ship and told to just steer carefully.
Her husband, Guy of Lusignan,
was spectacularly bad at strategy, which unfortunately didn't stop him from trying. Sibylla, on the other hand, held the city together through charm, diplomacy, and occasional acts of quiet ruthlessness. During the siege of Jerusalem, she took command when the men around her were panicking. She walked the walls in full armor, distributing what food was left, speaking softly to soldiers who knew they were doomed. The chroniclers barely mention this. Too unseemly, perhaps, for a woman to be the calm one while the knights fell apart. And yet, in letters and second-hand accounts, the picture forms she was a leader and a capable one. She died of plague soon after. Because of course she did, it was the 12th century. But for a brief moment, she was both queen and commander. The cross-dressing soldiers. You might think that disguising oneself as a man to fight was rare, but in truth it was practically a subgenre of medieval life. Across Europe, court records and local chronicles mention women dressed in men's clothes found bearing arms. Most were punished, naturally, but some were quietly tolerated, especially during times of war, when the army was desperate and paperwork was less of a priority. One of my favorite cases comes from 14th century France, a woman named Jeanne de Belleville. Her story is less saintly and more piratey. When her husband, a Breton noble, was executed by the French crown, Jeanne didn't write an angry letter. She sold her estates, bought 3 ships, painted them black, and began attacking French vessels along the coast. Her flag was blood red, her motto essentially revenge, and her career as a pirate queen lasted for more than a decade. Chroniclers later called her the Lioness of Brittany, which sounds romantic, but was medieval shorthand for terrifying widow who won't stop murdering people, and yet she managed to live out her days in exile. Never captured, never forgiven. Naturally, her story was later softened into something more noble. She became a patriotic widow instead of a professional menace, because heaven forbid we admit she enjoyed it. when armor wasn't just a costume. It's easy to imagine these women in armor as exceptions, as curiosities, but archaeological finds suggest otherwise. In Poland, a grave from the early 1200s revealed a woman buried with a sword, dagger, and military belt, items identical to those found with male knights. For years, historians insisted it must have been a symbolic burial, because of course that's easier than rewriting the textbooks, but once again DNA said otherwise. She was no symbol. She was a soldier. You might start to notice a pattern here. Women fight, die, get buried like warriors, and men with shovels centuries later go, well, that can't be right. Enter Joan. And then, of course, there's Jeanne d'Arc, or as English speakers know her, Joan of Arc. You can almost hear the music swell when her name appears. She's been turned into everything over the centuries. Saint, savior, martyr, mascot, and motivational poster. But in life, Joan was compo. Hey there. If you're still with me, eyes half closed, maybe listening in the dark, and let's drift onward. We've seen the women of the steppes, of the crusades, of chariots and castles. Now we enter a world of silk and steel, a time that pretended to be civilized, even as it still bled from its wars. The Renaissance liked to call itself a rebirth, and it wasn't in the sense that humanity was once again very proud of itself for rediscovering things it had mostly forgotten. But even in this so-called rebirth, women who fought were still expected to stay politely in the margins. Luckily, a few of them didn't. The duelists of the drawing room. Our story begins, oddly enough, not on a battlefield, but in a ballroom. France, early 1600s. The air smells faintly of perfume and powder, and somewhere in the crowd, two noble women are staring daggers at each other. They were known as femmes fortes, strong women, the kind who could quote Latin, handle a rapier, and argue theology before breakfast. Among them was Julie d'Aubigny, better known to history as La Maupin. Julie was difficult to categorize. She was a duelist, a singer, a cross-dresser, and a fugitive, often all in the same week. When her lover joined a convent, Julie, being romantic in the most impractical way possible, burned the convent down to help her escape. She then fled the country, joined an opera company, and performed on stage in men's clothes. When challenged to a duel for this, she accepted and won. You could say she was the 17th century's idea of chaos personified, but she was also a reminder that even in the most restrictive societies, some women simply refused to stay written out. Later, historians tried to call her eccentric, which is historian code for, we have no idea what to do with this person. The mercenary sisters of Italy. Let's drift a little south to Italy, where city-states rose and fell as quickly as fashion trends. There, in the late 1400s, we find Caterina Sforza, the Countess of Forlì. She was born into one of those families that made the Borgias look like amateurs. When her husband was assassinated, she seized control of his fortress by pretending to negotiate, then took the gatehouse and turned the cannons around on the assassins. When the rebels threatened to kill her children unless she surrendered, she climbed the walls, lifted her skirts, and shouted that she could make more. Subtle, no. Effective, very. Machiavelli, who witnessed it all, later mentioned her in his writings as an example of courage, though, naturally, he concluded she was still too emotional. But behind the legend, she was a skilled tactician, running her lands and leading troops until, inevitably, men decided it was time for her to stop. And when they captured her, she refused to confess to anything. She simply said, "You may take my body, but never my will," which is a rather elegant way to tell history to go to hell. Letters from the front. Not all women could lead armies, but some could write about them. In the 16th century, while men chronicled their campaigns with endless lists of dates and casualties, a few women recorded what war actually felt like. One of them was Margaret Cavendish, an English noblewoman who lived through the Civil War. She didn't fight, but she wrote, endlessly, boldly about politics, science, philosophy, and the absurdities of war. Her contemporaries called her Mad Madge, Because, of course, when a woman is too intelligent to ignore, the next best option is to call her crazy. In her essays, she imagined armies of women defending cities, societies run by queens, and soldiers who fought not with swords but with wit. It was fantasy, yes, but with a sharp edge of protest. When the world wouldn't let her fight physically, she fought on paper. And she wasn't alone. In France, Madame de Sévigné described sieges and revolts in letters, so vivid that generals later cited them as eyewitness accounts. They weren't soldiers, but they were historians, quietly reclaiming their right to record the truth. The samurai who wouldn't fade. Let's wander east for a moment and across the seas to feudal Japan. Here, too, the stories were tidied up for later audiences. But once again, the bones have their own tales. During Japan's civil wars, many samurai women, called anabugeisha, fought to defend their homes. One of the most famous was Tomoe Gozen, a 12T. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, and honestly, I'd be impressed if you are. Let's drift a little further through the mists of history tonight. We've wandered among the Scythians and Amazons, followed the disguised fighters of the Crusades, and listened to women who wrote their way back into a world that had forgotten them. Now we'll visit the ones who didn't bother to hide or to ask permission, queens who put on armor, who led armies, who terrified diplomats, and who, naturally, were later described as unfeminine, mad, or difficult, because of course they were. Let's start somewhere hot, dusty, and slightly uncomfortable. North Africa in the 17th century. There, in what is now Angola, lived Queen Nzinga Mbande. She was born in 1583, when Portuguese colonizers were still pretending that the word trade meant something other than raiding villages for slaves. Her father was the ruler of the Ndongo people, and Nzinga grew up watching her homeland squeezed by European greed and local rivalries. When she was sent to negotiate with the Portuguese, the governor offered her no chair, a reminder of who he thought held the power. So Nzinga, naturally, had one of her attendants kneel on all fours and sat upon his back, because if the world wouldn't give her a throne, she'd just make one. Negotiations failed, of course. They usually did. And so Nzinga went to war, personally leading armies, forging alliances, and earning a reputation fierce enough that European soldiers started calling her the Amazon, which is always the shorthand label for a woman doing something they didn't think women were supposed to do. She fought for decades. She survived betrayal, exile, and Portuguese gunfire. And somehow, she died peacefully in her 80s. A rarity for anyone who dared to defy both empire and gender expectations. After her death, her story was smoothed over by colonial chroniclers, retold as if she were a curiosity, not a commander. But the memory of the woman who made her own throne never really left Angola. Now let's drift north, across the Mediterranean, and several centuries backward in time. It's somewhere around the year 690 CE, and we're in North Africa again, but this time, in the Ores Mountains of Algeria. The woman standing on the ridge, watching Arab armies approach, is known simply as Dihya, sometimes called al-Kahina, the soothsayer, because naturally when a woman shows strategic genius, the assumption is that she must have magic. Dihya was a Berber queen who led a desperate, stunning resistance against the Umayyad expansion. For years, her forces actually drove the invaders back, forcing them out of territory they thought was already theirs. She was, for a time, the most powerful ruler in North Africa, but of course, the chronicles written later by her enemies described her as a sorceress, because calling a woman brilliant was apparently too hard. Eventually, she was defeated and killed in battle. But her story lingered, a ghost in the chronicles, a rumor in the mountains. And in that strange way history works, her enemies' effort to erase her ensured she'd be remembered. From the dust of North Africa, we'll now float east, to India. Around the mid-1800s, there we meet Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, one of those names that Indian schoolchildren still whisper like a charm. She was a young widow when the British decided that her kingdom, conveniently, should no longer exist. The British East India Company had a rule. If a ruler died without a biological male heir, the territory could be annexed. Lakshmibai had adopted a son, but the British said no, because of course they did. So she did the logical thing. She strapped her son to her back, mounted a horse, and rode into battle. In the Indian Rebellion of 1857, Rani Lakshmibai became the face of resistance, or, depending on your perspective, rebellion. Contemporary British accounts described her as the Jezebel of India because there's apparently a law somewhere that powerful women must always be compared to biblical seductresses. Indian poetry, meanwhile, remembered her differently. A mother, a warrior, a flame. She died in combat, sword in hand, one of those inconvenient endings that makes it hard to write her off as a passive victim of empire. But let's not stop there. Let's drift west again to Russia and to a young princess who had no particular reason to become an empress, let alone a conqueror. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German noble, and brought to St. Petersburg at 16 to marry the heir to the Russian throne, a man who loved toy soldiers more than real ones. She became Catherine the Great eventually, and before she did, she learned two things. First, how to survive in a court full of people who would rather see her dead, and second, that Russia could be, if your eyes are still open, that's impressive. If they're half closed, that's even better, because tonight we're still drifting gently through the long, quiet corridors of forgotten history, the kind lined with faint torchlight, where the sound of marching feet slowly fades into dreams. We've seen queens in armor, warlords in silk, and widows on horseback. Now we're stepping into a new age, one that looked, on the surface, a little more modern. Gunpowder instead of spears, printing presses instead of scrolls. But beneath all that, the old patterns hummed on. Women who fought, led, or bled, and then were quietly written out of the official story. Because even as revolutions claimed to stand for freedom, equality, and justice, they usually meant for men. Let's start softly in France around the 1790s. The air smells like gunpowder and cheap bread. The crowds are restless as usual, and in the middle of all this chaos stands a woman with cropped hair, a plain soldier's jacket, and the name Thérèse Figuier. She joined Napoleon's armies disguised as a man, calling herself sans gêne, which loosely translates to without embarrassment. It suited her. Thérèse fought in several campaigns, was wounded more than once, and eventually revealed her identity, at which point the army, having no idea what to do, quietly shuffled her into less visible duties. Later she published her memoirs, which were predictably dismissed as exaggerated, because as every historian of the time seemed to agree, it was far easier to imagine women swooning than sword fighting. Still, her story survived, quietly, in the margins of Napoleonic lore, where the unsanctioned heroes tend to hide. Of course, France had another, louder, revolutionary woman, Olympe de Gouges. She didn't fight on battlefields exactly. Her weapon was the pen. In 1791, she wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, a fiery response to the supposedly universal rights of man. It began quite sensibly. Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. You'd think that would be uncontroversial, given all the guillotining happening in the name of liberty. But naturally, it was taken as scandalous. Olympe was mocked, arrested, and ultimately executed. Her crime wasn't violence, it was audacity. She had demanded that revolutions practice what they preached, and in return she was silenced. Meanwhile, across the ocean, another kind of rebellion was stirring. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791, was a storm of emancipation, enslaved people rising up against the might of France. And there two women fought. One of them was Sanité Belair, a lieutenant under Toussaint Louverture. She wasn't content to cook or carry messages. She led troops, commanded respect, and fought alongside her husband in open battle. When the French captured them, she refused a blindfold at her execution. She wanted to look her captors in the eye. And when her husband hesitated, she ordered him to die first, and because she knew he wouldn't face it otherwise. In Haitian history, Sanité became a symbol of courage. In European accounts, she was barely mentioned. It took 2 centuries for her name to appear on Haitian currency, a small, belated nod to the woman who'd refused to bow her head. Let's drift south now, toward South America, another continent humming with rebellion. By the early 1800s, colonial rule was crumbling, and independence movements were everywhere. In Venezuela, there was Juana Ramirez de Azbaje, known later as La Avanzadora, the Advancer. She led artillery units in the war against Spain, reportedly manning cannons when her male counterparts fled. In Argentina, Juana Azurduy de Padilla rode into battle pregnant, commanded troops, and after her husband's death, kept fighting for independence. When independence was finally achieved, her contributions were politely forgotten. She died in poverty. Only in the 20th century did Bolivia name a province after her. A quiet correction of a very loud omission. You might notice a theme here. Revolutions are often more comfortable celebrating liberty, in theory, than equality in practice. Now we drift to Britain in the early 1800s. The age of empire is in full swing. The red-coated soldiers marching across the world, and among them, though you wouldn't see her at first glance, was Hannah Snell. She dressed as a man, calling herself James Gray, and joined the Royal Marines in 1747. She fought in India, took musket fire to the leg, and performed minor surgery on herself to remove the bullet. Because apparently the nearest field surgeon wasn't an option, when she finally revealed her true identity, she was granted an army pension, an extraordinary outcome for the time. London newspapers turned her into a celebrity. For a few brief years, the city adored its FEMA. If you've somehow stayed awake through this entire journey, congratulations. You've just outlasted several centuries of historical neglect. But if your eyelids are heavy, that's all right. This part is meant to be quiet. Tonight, we're not charging into battle anymore. We're wandering through museums, dusty archives, and the soft echoing corridors of memory, tracing the slow, careful work of rediscovery, because the women warriors didn't vanish. They were buried, in tombs and footnotes, and in the polite disinterest of later historians. And then slowly, one by one, the clues began to reappear. Let's start, as archaeologists often do, with bones. In 1878, on a chilly Swedish island called Birka, a grave was discovered, a Viking warrior, buried with a full set of weapons, 2 horses, and the air of serious importance. For over a century, no one questioned that this was a man, because of course it was. Who else would be buried with a sword, an axe, and the symbols of command? And then in 2017, someone ran a DNA test, and the warrior turned out to be a woman. The academic community briefly lost its collective composure. Some claimed the bones must have been mislabeled. Others suggested she was symbolically buried as a warrior. A nice way of saying, please, let's not rewrite the textbooks yet. But the evidence was clear. She was a commander and she was female. The Viking sagas had mentioned such women, of course. Shield maidens, battle maidens, daughters of war. But those tales were treated as myth, not memory. Until suddenly, one grave made them seem a little less fictional. And once that door cracked open, others began to follow. Across Scythian burial sites in the Eurasian steppe, from southern Russia to Kazakhstan, archaeologists started finding women buried with bows, quivers, and horse gear. Their bones showed signs of riding, archery, and sometimes healed battle wounds. For generations, they'd been labeled princesses, because male scholars couldn't quite reconcile jewelry and weaponry in the same tomb. Now we know the Scythians were likely the real-life inspiration for the Greek myth of the Amazons, nomadic horsewomen who fought alongside men. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The myth that male historians used to dismiss women warriors turned out to be based on women who actually existed. Meanwhile, in China, ancient records spoke of the Scythian era, when an empress ruled, and her court was full of scholars, soldiers, and women with rank. In recent years, archaeologists have found graves of women buried with military insignia from the Tang dynasty. For centuries, such evidence was ignored, not because it wasn't there, but because no one was looking for it. History, as it turns out, only reveals what you're willing to see. Even in Rome, that bastion of male military virtue, hints have surfaced. On the empire's northern frontiers, in what's now Britain and Germany, graves of female skeletons have been found near forts, buried with military gear, horse harnesses, and even armor fittings. Were they camp followers? Traders? Soldiers? We don't know. But the line between support and participation has always been fuzzier than textbooks suggest, and the Roman historians, a meticulous, egotistical, and often slightly paranoid, never could resist erasing inconvenient people. Women who fought or led, or even advised in battle, didn't fit the marble ideal of the Roman hero, so they were quietly left out. The rediscovery of these women, through archaeology, anthropology, and sheer stubborn curiosity, has been slow and oddly emotional, because when the evidence doesn't fit your expectations, it forces you to look at your own assumptions. The truth is, historians weren't lying exactly. They were filtering. Centuries of male scribes, monks, chroniclers, and professors built the canon of history like a wall, neat, orderly, solid. And when something didn't fit that architecture, a queen leading an army, a mother wielding a spear, a female skeleton with a sword, it got filed under anomaly. But anomalies add up, and eventually, they start to look a lot like the rule. Now let's drift to the 20th century, the age of rediscovery and reinterpretation. In the 1970s, feminist historians began asking uncomfortable questions. Where were the women in ancient warfare? Why do we accept mythical Amazons as fantasy, but assume all real soldiers were men? Those questions turned into excavations, and excavations turned into headlines. In the 1980s and 1990s, Soviet and Western archaeologists in Kazakhstan and southern Russia unearthed dozens of Scythian graves, showing women buried with weapons, sometimes a third of all warrior burials, in a given site. That's not a myth. That's a pattern. The skeletons told their own quiet stories. Arrow wounds in ribs, healed fractures in arm, to the quiet end of our long, drifting journey. If you're still awake, well, congratulations. You've just listened to nearly a millennium and a half of inconvenient women, all of whom were supposed to stay home but didn't. And if you aren't awake, that's all right too. This is the part of the story that feels like a lullaby anyway. Let's drift, just one more time, back through the dust of time. Because the women warriors didn't really vanish. They were just buried. Literally sometimes. In 1988, a grave was found in Birka, Sweden. A grand warrior's burial. 2 horses. Swords, shields, arrows, gaming pieces for strategy. For over a century, the skeleton was proudly called the ultimate Viking male warrior. Until one day someone decided to test the bones. And the DNA came back female. The academic reaction was almost funny in its denial. Surely she was symbolic. Surely those weren't her weapons. Surely she had some kind of ceremonial role, because heaven forbid a Viking woman actually command men into battle. But there she was, silent in her grave for 1,000 years, still holding onto her sword. The same thing happened in Mongolia. Burial after burial revealed women interred with bows and armor. Their leg bones thickened from horseback riding. They were the descendants of the Scythian tradition, real women who lived the so-called Amazon myth. And then in the deserts of North Africa, archaeologists uncovered tombs belonging to the ancient Berber queens who once fought Rome. They had been half forgotten, half sanitized into local legend. The bones said otherwise. It turns out the earth remembers what the history books tried to forget. By the 21st century, the pattern was too clear to ignore. Each excavation, each DNA test whispered the same quiet truth. that ancient armies were not as male as the chroniclers insisted. It wasn't a modern feminist reimagining of the past. It was simply what was already there, under the soil, waiting. And perhaps the most remarkable thing isn't that these women existed, but that they kept existing, century after century, even as they were erased, renamed or rewritten. We like to imagine that progress is a straight line, that once something is known, it stays known. But history doesn't work that way. It's more like sleep. You fall into it, you forget, and then you wake up again, slowly blinking, trying to remember what was lost. The women warriors were never really erased. They were simply waiting for someone to remember them properly. And so, from Scythian riders buried with their bows, to the nameless bones under Viking soil, to the quiet resistance of Haitian and Filipino fighters, and the noble women who refused to stay behind palace walls, they all share one silent, stubborn thread. They fought, they lost, they were forgotten, and then very slowly they began to return. If you visit certain museums now, say the British Museum or the National Museum of Denmark, you'll sometimes find a label that reads, "Warrior sex unknown," possibly female. It's not a triumphant correction. It's a gentle one. A small factual whisper that says we're learning to listen again. And there's something beautifully humble about that. Because history at its core isn't about certainty. It's about curiosity and a willingness to be wrong. So when we ask why women warriors were erased, perhaps the answer is simply because people forgot how to look for them. And when we finally did, they were still there. Maybe that's all the reassurance we need. That even after centuries of silence, truth doesn't die, it just rests for a while. So as we close tonight, let's think of them. Those who fought, who were buried, who were doubted. Think of them in armor, hair unbound, steady on horseback or standing in the dust before a fortress gate. Think of them as part of the long, quiet heartbeat of human history. Steady, persistent, inconveniently alive. Because every time another archaeologist brushes dirt off a sword and realizes the skeleton holding it wasn't a man, somewhere a tiny corner of history exhales, and the silence gets a little bit shorter. And maybe that's a fitting place to end. The women warriors never truly vanished. They were simply waiting to be remembered by people curious enough to look and gentle enough to listen. So if you're still awake, thank you for wandering through these forgotten lives with me tonight. And if you've drifted off somewhere along the way, well, that's perfectly all right too. Because after all, the past has always been a good place to fall asleep. Soft outro music fades, the sound of wind, maybe a heartbeat of a drum, echoing from centuries away. The end of Who Were the Women Warriors Hidden in Ancient Armies? And why were they erased from history? Would you like me to write a short outro narration plus subscribe? If you're still here, still listening, perhaps half asleep, thank you for wandering this far with me. We've drifted from windswept steppes to marble halls, from crusader walls to palace courts, and from queens in armor to pirates on the open sea. But before we close our lantern and let the centuries rest, there's one more corner of this story we should visit. A place where myth and memory intertwine, where the past doesn't end, but rather echoes. Because though history often tried to bury its women warriors, the earth itself, quite literally, began to give them back. The bones that wouldn't stay quiet. In the late 20th century, something quietly revolutionary began to happen. Archaeologists, with better tools, better science, and perhaps a little more humility, started to realize that many of the male warriors found in ancient graves weren't men at all. The first hints came from the far north in the frozen soil of Scandinavia. For over a century, a famous burial in Birka, Sweden, had been described as that of a powerful Viking warrior, a high-ranking man buried with sword, spear, and 2 horses. He was so famous, in fact, that illustrations of the Birka warrior filled textbooks. Then in 2017, DNA testing quietly shattered the myth. He was not a he. The warrior of Birka was a woman. She'd been buried not as a token or a priestess or a wife, but with the full insignia of command, a game board for strategy, weapons for war and horses for travel, a general, not a bride, and suddenly centuries of assumptions began to crack. Because if she could exist, what else had we misread? Rewriting the graves. Soon after, more discoveries followed. In Central Asia, graves once labeled male nomads turned out to be women, sometimes adolescents, sometimes elders unburied with bows, arrows, and war gear. In Britain, a so-called chieftain's grave contained female bones under a helmet of iron. In Poland, another woman lay with a sword across her rib, not symbolically placed near her, but upon her, in the position of a warrior who had carried it in life. Each new find was like a whisper from beneath the soil. You forgot us. But we remember. It wasn't that archaeologists had been lying. They had simply assumed unconsciously, automatically, that a grave with weapons must belong to a man. And so across generations the evidence was literally mislabeled. History, it seems, had been erased not with malice but with habit. And habit is a harder enemy than any army. The politics of memory. Because you see, history is never just about what happened. It's about who gets to say what happened. For most of written history, that power, the quill, the parchment, the printing press, and belonged almost entirely to men. And so even when women fought, led, or ruled, their stories were softened, or reframed, or politely dismissed as exceptions. A queen became a helper. A general became a symbol. A pirate became a legend. And over time, legend became myth, until one day someone looked back and said, well, if it were true, surely we'd have found proof. Not realizing that the proof had always been there, simply misfiled, under the wrong name. The Quiet Return. Today, a new generation of scholars, many of them women, are slowly rebuilding the record. They read between the lines of medieval chronicles. They re-examined bones and artifacts once dismissed as ceremonial. They asked the question that was once unthinkable. What if women were there all along, and we simply didn't see them? In museums, labels are changing. Statues once labeled warrior are being relabeled female warrior. And in classrooms, students now learn that the ancient world was far less simple and far more interesting than the stories we inherited. Because history, like the women it forgot, refuses to stay silent forever. The final thought. So perhaps when we speak of forgotten women warriors, we should choose our words more carefully. They weren't truly forgotten. They were hidden, sometimes by others, sometimes by time, and sometimes by the need to survive. But they were always there, behind every shield wall, beneath every banner, in every story we were told and every one we weren't. And now, as we listen in the dim quiet of night, we can almost hear them again, the sound of armor shifting in the dark, the whisper of a blade drawn not for glory but for survival. History isn't just what we remember. It's what we are finally willing to see. Gentle pause. And so ends our long journey, from the Scythians to the samurai, from queens and crusaders to rebels and raiders. 1,000 years of silence unburied, one whisper at a time. Now, if your eyes are closing, if you're still here, eyes heavy, maybe only half listening, you've traveled far. Through battlefields and ballrooms, deserts and frozen plains, tombs and thrones. You've met queens, pirates, poets, and soldiers, all trying in their own quiet way to carve a place in a world that kept trying to erase them. So before we drift off completely, let's spend a little time at the edge of history, where memory begins to fade, and myth takes over, because sometimes that's where the truth hides best. The myth of forgetting. You see, the idea that these women were erased isn't entirely right. They were written down, often carefully, vividly, by people who just didn't believe them. A chronicler might note with mild disbelief that a woman was seen in armor, and then, unable to process it, he'd add, it must have been witchcraft. A general might record that women fought bravely beside men, and then assure the reader that this was a sign of barbarism, It's as if the medieval world could look directly at something, describe it perfectly, and still decide it didn't exist. Rather like the way we sometimes ignore our own reflection when it doesn't fit the story we want to tell. And so century after century, their presence faded, not because the evidence was gone, but because the lens through which we viewed it was clouded by assumption, the soft power of the storyteller. But here's the strange thing about stories. They always find a way back. In folklore, legends, and grandmothers' tales whispered by firesides, these women never quite disappeared. They became the Amazons, fierce, half-imagined, half-remembered. They became ghostly queens who rode through storms, pirate ladies haunting the coasts, nameless knights buried in churchyards. Even when the historians forgot their names, the storytellers did not. And now, centuries later, we've come full circle, using science, archaeology, and a touch of imagination to rediscover what ballads and myths never stopped singing. It turns out the storytellers were right all along. The armor of memory. If you walk through a museum today, you might see a sword behind glass. It might be labeled Unknown Warrior. But perhaps it wasn't unknown. Perhaps it was simply inconvenient. The steel doesn't care who held it. It remembers the weight of a hand, the strength in the swing. The soil doesn't care whether the warrior was called sir or lady. It keeps its secrets until we are finally ready to listen. And when we listen, truly listen, history becomes richer, fuller, and far less lonely. Because suddenly the past isn't just a parade of kings and conquerors. It's a chorus. And half the voices had been muted for far too long. The echo in the present. And maybe that's the point. The rediscovery of these women isn't just about rewriting textbooks. It's about reminding ourselves that courage doesn't belong to one gender, one nation, or one century. Every time we find a woman's name under layers of dust, we're reminded that history isn't fixed, it's alive. It changes as we do. It grows as we grow, and it forgives us eventually. For the centuries we spent not paying attention. Perhaps that's why these discoveries feel strangely emotional. Because they're not just about them. They're about us, learning to see what's been in front of us all along. The long sleep of history. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, think of them, the women who rode out into the dark, knowing that no one would remember their names. And doing it anyway. Think of the ships rocking on distant seas, the flicker of torches on fortress walls, the sound of a sword sliding into its sheath at dawn. They are still there in the quiet between centuries, waiting to be remembered, or perhaps just quietly satisfied that we're finally starting to look, and maybe that's enough. Soft exhale. So thank you for listening and for staying awake and or not, through the long, drowsy march of forgotten history. The world is full of ghosts, but some of them wear armor. Sleep well, traveler, and may the past for once keep watch over you. Would you like me to now create a matching outro segment, the kind you'd hear at the end of a sleepless historian video, gentle fade-out lines, a soft call to subscribe, and a quiet closing reflection? If you're still awake and are drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming, we've reached the end of our long journey together, a journey through forgotten names, half-buried bones, and the spaces between what was written and what was lived. And maybe that's where all of history truly lives, not in the victories carved into marble, but in the quiet places where memory hums beneath the noise. The unearthed voices. It's strange, isn't it? For centuries, these women were hidden in plain sight. Their armor rusted in the ground, their stories twisted into myths, their courage footnoted or explained away. But dust has a long memory, and when archaeologists brushed it aside, the truth began to breathe again. We found graves, not legends, with spears and swords buried beside women's bones. We found letters and chronicles that no longer seemed so unbelievable. And suddenly all those impossible stories made sense. It wasn't that women hadn't fought. It was that no one had wanted to admit it. Because the moment you admit that women fought, the whole story changes, not just the battles, but the boundaries of what we thought humanity looked like. The quiet rebellion of memory. And yet, even now, the rediscovery of these women feels like an act of quiet rebellion, because to remember someone the world tried to forget is, in itself, an act of defiance. Each unearthed grave, each retranslated text, each whispered legend, it's a small rebellion against centuries of silence. It's history saying softly but firmly, you missed someone. And maybe that's the most human thing about us, our ability to lose things, and then to keep looking for them again. The threads that remain. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost see them, not as statues or saints, but as people. A Scythian girl stringing her bow in the cold dawn, her horse snorting clouds into the air. A crusader's wife, her armor dented, her hair tucked beneath a borrowed helmet. A pirate queen watching the sea for sails, one hand on her sword, the other on the tiller. A samurai woman kneeling before battle, her blade gleaming like moonlight. A queen in a hot, dusty court, sitting proudly on the back of her kneeling attendant, because no one offered her a chair. One by one, they rise from the page, fierce, tired, alive, and the world feels a little wider for it. Why they were erased. So, why were they erased? Maybe because they complicated the story too much. Maybe because men writing history didn't know what to do with women who didn't wait to be rescued. Or maybe because every society at some point needs to believe in its own tidy version of order, and women with swords simply didn't fit. But the truth was never tidy. It never will be. And that's what makes it beautiful. The gentle reckoning. Now, centuries later, we have a choice. We can keep telling history the same way, a clean story of kings and conquerors, or we can let the cracks show. We can let the light through. We can remember that half the world's courage once went unrecorded but not undone, because remembering doesn't just change the past, it changes us. It reminds us that history isn't a list of names to memorize. It's a mirror, and every time we look into it, we see a little more of ourselves looking back. The last watch. So as the candles burn low and the room grows still, imagine them once more. The women who rode out, who stood fast, who dared to exist loudly in a world that wanted them silent. They are gone, yes, but not lost, because the act of speaking their names even now brings them home. History sleeps lightly after all, and every whisper wakes another ghost. A pause, soft breath. So thank you for staying with me through this long, gentle walk through time. You've met the forgotten, the erased, and the inconvenient. And maybe as you drift toward sleep, you'll carry them with you. Quiet sentinels in the corridors of memory. Sleep well, traveler. The past is watching over you tonight. And for once, it remembers. Would you like me to now write the official outro? Monologue, a soft-spoken end credits. Voiceover that thanks the listener, fades into ambient music, and invites them to subscribe in the same dreamlike tone. You're still here, and maybe that's fitting. Because history never really ends, it just waits, quietly for someone to keep listening. The stories we've uncovered together, of horsewomen and pirates, queens and poets, duelists and dreamers, they aren't just fragments of the past. They're pieces of a much larger truth. That courage is not bound by gender, and that silence, no matter how long it lasts, can always be broken. The forgotten companions. When you think of ancient armies, the shields, the banners, the dust of marching feet, it's easy to imagine them as purely male worlds. But in the quiet spaces between the battles, women were always there. Some as healers carrying water and binding wounds, some as spies, slipping through enemy lines with nothing but wit and courage. And some, the ones history pretended not to see, stood shoulder to shoulder with men, blades drawn, faces streaked with ash and sweat. They fought not for glory but for survival, for family, for homeland, for freedom, or for reasons we'll never fully know. And maybe that's what makes them so haunting. The way they remind us that bravery often happens in the margins, unrecorded and unpraised. When the page turns to dust. It's strange, isn't it? For every name that made it into a chronicle, there are thousands more that didn't. Maybe a chronicler looked at a woman holding a sword and thought, that must be a mistake. Maybe a scribe copying a tale a century later changed a she into a he. And so, little by little, they disappeared, and not in battle, but in ink. But history, like the tide, has a way of washing things back to shore. The bones we find today, and the swords buried with them, the armor sized for smaller shoulders, and they whisper the truth the words forgot. They remind us that no erasure lasts forever. Across time's mirror, if you listen closely, you can almost hear them now. The laughter of La Maupin echoing through a Parisian opera house. The defiant cry of Caterina Sforza standing atop her fortress wall. The quiet scratching of Margaret Cavendish's quill as she invents whole worlds on paper. The ring of Tomogozen's blade in the dawn fog of a battlefield. All these echoes scattered across continents and centuries, hum together in one long refrain. We were here. We were always here. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind of immortality, to be remembered not as perfect, but as real. The lanterns we carry. As we close the final page of this story, think of yourself holding a small lantern. Its flame is faint, the color of old parchment and starlight, but steady. It's made of memory. Every time we speak one of these forgotten names, the light grows a little brighter. You don't have to be a warrior to carry it. You only have to remember, to tell the stories again, to look at history not as something finished, but as something still unfolding, still waiting to be corrected, still waiting to be seen. So let the last image fade. A line of figures walking through mist, women of every age and century, armor glinting softly under the moon. They turn once toward us, silent but smiling, before they vanish into the horizon. And in their place the words remain, quiet, stubborn, alive. Because no matter how deeply history buries its daughters, the earth always remembers their names. Soft pause. The voice lowers, almost a whisper. Thank you for walking this long road through forgotten time. May the stories of the unseen keep you company tonight. May they remind you that truth endures, even when written in invisible ink. Good night, traveler. Sleep among the echoes. Tomorrow we'll begin again. Would you like me to continue with Part 12, the epilogue, how modern archaeology is rewriting their stories? A calm, reflective final chapter that links the ancient women warriors to current discoveries and modern recognition. If you're somehow still awake, and if you are, you've earned a medal. Let's drift one last time through the edges of history. We've wandered from Scythian steppe burials to European dueling halls, from the dusty hills of North Africa to the misted plains of Japan. We've seen women who disguised themselves, commanded armies, and refused to stay politely invisible. But now let's return to the present, or at least to the quiet work of those who study the past. Because as it turns out, the story of women warriors isn't finished. It's still being rewritten, one excavation, one misread skeleton at a time. The archaeologists who whisper to bones. Modern archaeology at its best is an act of apology. It's a soft voice leaning over the soil and saying, "We got this wrong." For generations, excavations labeled graves by assumption. If a burial contained weapons, it was marked male. If it held jewelry or beads, female. That was the unspoken rule. Tidy, binary, comfortable. And then, the DNA tests began. Somewhere in the late 20th century, quiet revolutions began in university labs. Samples from old skeletons, the warriors of the Viking Age, the Scythian nomads, the Bronze Age chiefs, began to be tested for sex chromosomes. And to everyone's mild horror and fascination, many of those graves turned out to belong to women. The so-called Burka warrior in Sweden, once confidently described as a Viking chieftain, turned out to be female. She'd been buried with a sword, 2 shields, a pair of horses, and a gaming set, the ancient equivalent of a commander's tactical board. For more than a century, scholars had written about him, and then DNA quietly said her. It was as if the soil itself had rolled its eyes and muttered, "About time you noticed." Redrawing the map. The discoveries didn't stop there. From Mongolia to Hungary, from the Caucasus to the Andes, grave after grave began rewriting what we thought we knew. Skeletons once dismissed as wives of warriors were found with arrowheads lodged in their ribs. Burial sites long labeled as male soldiers turned out to belong to women with calloused hands and riding injuries, signs of long military service. It wasn't that women had suddenly appeared in history. It was that we'd finally stopped looking away. And once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. The gentle undoing of erasure. It's easy to be angry at how much was lost. How many names, how many songs, how many victories were quietly reassigned or erased. But there's something oddly beautiful about this slow correction. Because every rediscovered grave, every corrected inscription is a kind of resurrection. The past doesn't shout. It murmurs. And archaeology, when it's done right, is about learning to listen again, somewhere out there. Under layers of loam and centuries of forgetting, the stories are still waiting. Maybe in a barrow mound no one has touched yet. Maybe in a forgotten archive misfiled under the wrong name. Maybe in a museum label that just needs one small change. His to her. Modern descendants of old fire. And if you look around, the spirit of those forgotten women hasn't really gone anywhere. They're in the female soldiers serving in modern armies, often still underestimated. They're in the activists and journalists who fight battles of truth and voice, instead of blade and shield. They're in every person who refuses to accept that silence equals non-existence. History, after all, isn't static. It breathes through the living. And sometimes when the night is quiet enough, you can feel those older voices stirring, reminding us that courage doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. The final drift. So here we are, at the end of our long, meandering watch through time. From the buried tombs of Scythia to the gleaming palaces of Russia, from the deserts of Africa to the fortresses of India, the pattern is always the same. Women fought, led, created, and were written out, and now, slowly, tenderly, we're writing them back in. Maybe that's the real purpose of history. Not to glorify the victors, but to remember the forgotten. To listen again. To hold up a small lantern against the darkness and whisper, "We see you now." Soft, almost whispered. So if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. Somewhere, deep under the soil of time, the women who refuse to vanish are still marching, slowly, quietly, endlessly forward. Their swords are gone. But their stories have finally found their way home. Good night, and thank you for remembering them.